Good evening and welcome. It's a real pleasure to have you all here. This is really the first of a very important series of lectures and events here at the GSD, and I know that a number of people were celebrating in the library a few minutes ago. I think many of you might not have been here 5 years ago when we had a really wonderful event November of 2010 to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the urban design program here at the GSD. And it was really a special occasion because it was an opportunity for the school to celebrate all the things that had happened during these past 50 years and the fact that the GSD was the first urban design program in the US. I think since then a lot has happened, and but during that meeting, a number of people came together and decided that there should be a 50th anniversary urban design lectureship fund that would bring various individuals to the school to talk about issues related to urban design, whether they would be lectures, participation in reviews, and so on. And I want to really thank all the people, many of our faculty, many of our alumni, who participated in those discussions, and it was decided at that time that a leadership structure should be created, and I think some of you have heard this, but I want to thank Jay Chatterjee, who's joined us here, MAUD class of 65, Lee Cott, MAUD class of 70, Alex Krieger, MCUPD class of 77, and our own Moshe Safdie, who's here also in the audience, to be the chairs of this particular committee and to raise the funds. And they managed to convince 50 individuals, many of them here, to contribute to the lectureship fund. So I really want to thank all of you for everything that you've done and for making this event possible. When it came to planning who should give the first lecture, who better than the former chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Design, our own Professor Rahul Mehrotra, who was leading the department at that time and was very much involved in the conversations about the establishment of this particular program. I think for this group, Rahul needs no introduction. I had the pleasure of introducing him last semester. But it really is amazing to have a colleague here at the GSD who's contributed so much to not only the culture and life of the school, but also really to the field of urban design broadly, whether it's through his own practice and participation in projects in India and in other places, or through his own scholarship and writing. I think he's also been a wonderful university citizen, and through this project that you saw advertised, shown on the screen, the Kumbh Mela, was one of a group of faculty here at Harvard from the School of Public Health, from the Divinity School, to really create an incredible project that brought many faculty and students from the university to focus on a really exciting and a wonderful project that has now been documented in a publication. So I'm really looking forward, like all of you, I'm sure, to hearing Rahul give this very first lecture in this series. So please welcome Professor Rahul Mehrotra.
Thank you very much, Mohsin, and thank you all for being here. This is an absolute honor to do this, and for me, the intent of this lecture is to honor the legacy of urban design as a program at Harvard University that established the first formal North American program in urban design in 1960 here at the GSD. I also want to actually thank everyone in the department, my colleagues, who will recognize their influences as I progress through this talk. I think your support, intellectual, moral, emotional, has been absolutely incredible. Thank you very much. And to our wonderful staff, Caroline, Erica, Janessa, Sarah. And lastly, to Diane Davis, for insisting that I give this first UD 50 lecture in recognition of my 5 years here as chair of the department. Thank you, Diane. In my first month here at the GSD in September 2010, there occurred the conference that Mohsin was sort of referring to. It was organized by the former, It was organized by the former chair of the department, Alex Krieger, who set this together to celebrate 50 years of UD at Harvard. It was a dazzling affair with all the ingredients of urbanism, from new urbanism to everyday urbanism, of course, landscape urbanism, and all under this wonderfully constructive shadow of ecological urbanism. It's a really potent cocktail. And at the end of the conference, in my closing remarks as chair, I spoke about the unfulfilled potentials of urban design, something which became evident to me listening to the speakers at the conference. And so I'm going to break this talk into two parts. I'm just going to reflect really personal reflections of the 5 years I've spent here, but also the time here as a student and my understanding of urban design, really a personal reflection. And then the second half, I'm going to share with you some current research, which is what I'm sort of engaged with, but also research that opens up questions for urban design. In any case, in the conference, I became really aware of Surt's contribution. Naturally, that was celebrated. His focus both on inner and peripheral city and reactions to urbanism for the North American condition. In Can Our City Survive, 1942, which was based on the Siam discussions. I think the book really represents a bridge between his old life in Europe and his new life in the US and the issues that he was beginning to confront. And there are many interesting histories about the foundation of the department that came out of these discussions, and they're a wonderful read. Interesting to also see how there's this oscillation between the idea of civic design and urban design. But Surt concludes the book with a call for a holistic view of city life, evidence of his early sort of interests in the idea of urban design. Because Surt clearly saw synthesis at the heart of what he called urban design, a synthesis between disciplines that led in 1960 to the creation of what was very clearly an interdisciplinary program at the GSD in urban design, founded, I believe, on humanism. And it's interesting that a core required integrative course in 1960 in the first semester was called the Human Scale. At the conference to celebrate 50 years of the program, I could not help but somehow feel that this original spirit and mission of what Surt set out to be seems to be struggling to resist being trapped in a singular definition and paradigm of what urban design ought to be. I think more than the intellectual investment that has attempted to define and redefine urban design, it is really the changed circumstance in North America that is rendering it important somewhat in terms of its original intent and context. Advanced capitalism with neoliberal policies and democracy is a hellish combination for urban form, more generally for an urban design as we imagine its practice. I think the reality of operating in this environment has resulted in an overly anxious condition of protecting urban design, both in its market share, identity, and I think it's nowhere more palpable than in this very building. This is perhaps a trap because I think what results from this are boundaries of containment, completely in contradiction to the bridge metaphor that Surt used. Urban design as a bridge practice, one that implies flows and it's open, a practice that's plastic and reconfigures itself depending on the problem, the agents, the actors, and constituencies it has to influence. Plastic enough to even configure and reconfigure itself between built form and the broader ecologies of the natural system in which it's situated. In my understanding, this spirit was somewhat diminished, or has been somewhat diminished, or at least when I got here 5 or 6 years ago. When I was graduating from the program in 1987, public-private partnerships in city development was already in existence in the US and was becoming very evident. Battery Park City, which is where this sort of site sort of indicates, and the likes were the models of best practices, and they truly were. I remember studying Cooper Exted and the kind of guidelines they wrote and how they interfaced with private and public sort of enterprises. And this was really quite sort of interesting. Privatization has always existed, but these models within the American context were really interesting. But they began to, I believe, because going back to India and then looking at this with distance, they began to pose urban design as big architecture. And these were the kinds of emblematic projects that made that happen. And in some ways, it kind of narrowed the focus. And of course, there are great examples. I was speaking to Felipe this morning about these, the Rockefeller Center, many others, but these are large chunks within the city, very particular, actually to the condition of Manhattan more than anything else. But they began to get equated, one could sense this, with what urban design was. Now this model is exported from the North American landscape of deep democracy to landscapes of severe autocracy, China, the Middle East, and actually all across the globe and planet. And that has become the understanding, I believe, of urban design. This approach and practice is really pandering to capital in unprecedented ways, what I call the architecture and urban form of impatient capital. Naturally, this has its operating logic, as does capital, which is intrinsically impatient and assumes some forms of patience as it resides in universities like this one or foundations. Thus, they create the best forms of architecture and urban form in campuses, museums, etc., or at least sometimes. Capital, on account of its impatience, creates architecture and urban form, and often whimsical, most often vendor-driven for ease of speed of construction, with new roles emerging for architects who now interface with technology, but also exchange and access to information in a completely renewed relationship. Our own Farshid Musafi, in her book, The Function of Style, critically interrogates these new formations so vividly demonstrates the influences and the impulses that are creating this new landscape. This then, by extension, is an issue for urban design practitioners, the ideological stance of most patrons, which is largely based and invested in capitalism. Clearly, this imagination is also beginning to emerge in the production of our cities, where, like the simultaneous impulses of both autonomy and renewed interconnectedness of architectural objects, the city itself is being imagined in these terms. And I think what Farshid has done in that book, I often think the potential of extending that to look at new cities, towns, sort of big ensembles being created is incredible. Masdar is, for me, a case in point. For however proficient it's as an organism, somewhat disconnected from the world around them. And of course, you're seeing this all over the world in the form of these gated communities and towns in sort of the middle of nowhere, and sort of signaling an illusion, so to speak, of self-sufficiency. This sense of disengagement with reality has attracted criticisms of what urban design has come to mean. And the many forms of readings of urbanism emerging around us, for me, really serve as a productive critique of the unrealized potential of urban design to engage in more substantial ways in placemaking. And what is ironic is that perhaps that urban design as a practice is the only one that extends urbanism as a field on the ground. Furthermore, the usage of urbanism, at least for me, implies that it's a passive field of study, observational. The dictionary defines it as a study of cities or life, depending on the context it's used. Françoise Choe, in her book on the modern city, reminds us, to quote, that the word urbanism has caused us to forget the original terms historically represented a field of activity as defined by Serda in 1867. Of course, believing that the physical environment transforms social behavior, she has interrogated this term in wonderful ways. I mean, I'm sort of presenting a simplistic reading because the connotations are different in different contexts historically, but also it's sort of in some contexts aligned with its used as utopias in the way Cité and in the Garden City, Ebenezer Howard used it, etc. So it is, of course, it's a much more nuanced reading that's necessary, but in the most simplistic sort of overtures, it becomes this operational versus observational observational divide, because urban design with the prefix of urban to design makes it more pointed to design naturally. Herbert Simon's The Science of the Artificial has long been considered a seminal text for design theorists and researchers anxious to establish both a scientific status for design and most inclusive possible definitions for a designer. Embodied in Simon's often cited quote, again to quote Simon, "Everyone designs who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones." Similar to the early design methods movement, which defines design as a problem-solving, process-oriented activity rather than primarily concerned with the production of physical artifacts. And Simon's science of design was part of this broader project of unifying the social sciences with problem-solving as the glue. Naturally, the definition of urban then is a category that needs expansion. A number of the critiques of urban design that are projected or represented are often as an absolute without any specificity, or at least the aspirations to become an absolute position. This is the robustness of, I believe, urban design as a category where without being an absolute, it can have sufficient specificity to operate on the ground. In that sense, urban design as a practice operates across scales from a piece of street furniture to large-scale territorial operations with a humble approach to ground realities. And for me, the Atelier Bow Wow, made in Tokyo, I mean, this is one end of the spectrum, whether you begin to call it tactical kind of urbanism or acupuncture, whatever the strategies might be, it begins to look at scale in a completely different way and the moments of intervention in a completely different way versus the notion that urban design is big chunks of architecture. And I think another one that I think is really significant is Medellin, for example, what has happened there, which represents, the problems in Latin America, many parts of Asia, where you have, through very strategic interventions, many multiple kinds of forces put together, squatter settlements, parts of the urban fabric, transportation, the introduction, Alejandro Acheveri's sort of project, which is sort of museums and cultural centers. Camilio, both these guys are right here in the audience, who has sort of done this botanical garden and a beautiful intervention as public space and architecture. But a number of things coalesce together through a multiplicity of smaller sort of interventions, which this plan sort of represents. So it becomes many points where synergy is created through the urban system through operating at multiple scales simultaneously and results in incredible transformations in a landscape which was once just favelas, but accumulation of land parcels to create housing, but interventions. But the critical thing here is the scale, that even a bridge and a bench becomes as critical in the urban design moves as the larger ensemble, in this case, the station for the cable cars, or to connect communities that had never been connected, a kind of move which is very much part of that urban design repertoire, and you can see it here. But the interesting question then becomes that urban design is really about resolving sometimes bizarre adjacencies and trying to create cohesive form in a projective temporal scale, because this, of course, evolves and changes while some things maybe stay more stable for long. And this image represents the multiplicity of adjacencies here that come together in a resolution, implying this might change in 10 years, that might stay steady for 20 years. And so the temporal scale becomes a very critical part of this imagination rather than end-state planning, instrumentalized only through large-scale and big architecture. Yes. So, as a student in 1985, my friend Bill McElroy gave me this image. This was our first study of Roxbury, the first studio for elements of urban design in 85, when it was the first studio, and we had just come back with our studying Roxbury, and this was our first presentation we were photographing and converting into slides. Bill McElroy was the first Drucker Fellow and traveled, and he dug this out for me. So for me as a student, the definition of urban design was the closing of feedback loops between planning and architecture, and thus necessarily and explicitly human-centric, a field of contestation where the resolution is manifest by the resolution of spatial imagination coupled with the design of process. I saw advocacy as being integral to the practice of urban design. In fact, I saw urban design as being about activism, about drawing the disciplines of architecture, landscape, and planning closer together and being being the conduit, so to speak, the bridge for the critical feedback loops on which the survival and improvement of our cities and broader landscapes depended. Today, technology, of course, can be appropriated as a field for urban design in order to enhance this process of feedback. I understood that Ian McHarg and Olmsted enriched this crossover impulse. As much did Colin Rowe, who challenged us to negotiate disparities in the collage city in close adjacencies. Peter Rowe's work at that time on the middle landscape was already challenging urban design with engaging with our peri-urban conditions and setting out to build a taxonomy of components where making a middle landscape between the urban and rural, a new spatial and cultural mosaic of the house, garden, shopping mall, office park, in the commercial strip and freeway. One of the chapters was interestingly titled Wasteful Fragmentation or Pure Democracy. Contemporary students at that time, Guy Perry, and this is Sahel Al-Haji, who is from Jordan, were already beginning to explore the tension between build form and the landscape. This was sort of very palpable in terms of concerns in the late 80s. And Carl Steinitz, who was already engaging landscape architecture with a territorial dimension, he was engaging with the question of alternate futures, not as utopias, but as scenarios, using systemic thinking through the first, that's Carl Steinitz for those of you, using systemic thinking through the first generation models to project through robust interdisciplinary exercises what new urban formations might look like in a broadened landscape. Layering and stacking data, constructing feedback loops, Steinitz opened up a new way of mapping and discerning emerging relationships at the territorial scale. And of course, this then led to the idea of a sort of geodesign and much more sophistication with computer models. And I think the big come back to this for me, at least observing the landscape department in the last 5 years, is how I think my colleagues here, Charles Waldheim, Anita, many others, have taken these sort of ideas but embedded them within broader design cultures, giving it much more potency, I think, and great relevance for the future. More recently, I think the works of Jean Busquets, Philippe Correa, in their book titled 10 Lines, creates a wonderful catalog of applied research that aspires to create a new taxonomy and new ways of engaging with the design of cities and territories in the 21st centuries. Korea's Worm Eye View sort of brings together a collection of projects, infrastructure, topography, to represent their intertwined relationship. And his more recent work expands the scale even further to the continent, to discerning infrastructural implications on both the natural and built environment in the continent of South America. And I think so what I'm sort of trying to demonstrate here is this gamut. Although some of these crossovers were exceptions, the tense relationship between disciplines is something that must be respected and I believe still persists. Disciplinary knowledge and its integrity actually makes these crossovers much more robust. But this integrity must resist the simplistic impulses of branding. And I think Yves Blau's sort of edited volume in the Harvard Design Magazine attempted to expand this field of what urban design might mean, and I think it's very important for that sort of reason. Philip Geiser, who is an exchange student at the GSD, the other day pointed out to me in a conversation that the urban designer was a contemporary practicing polymath, and this sort of resonated. He said one who directs dialogues based processes, for in imagining spatial possibilities means directing movement, lifestyles, morals, and the interaction of individuals. This renders urban design highly influential in making the notion of the polymath particularly important in this formation. In all these discussions, the one thing that seems to characterize for me the practice of urban design was clearly the coupling of design and contestation. Contestation in the light of crucial intersections that were occurring in the world, something that for me only recently became kind of clear in what our colleague Neil Brenner constructed as the idea of the context and interrogating through this by nestling the context in its context, where the employing of meta-narratives to clarify the context in which the context of our operations sits is a useful instrument to imagine a precise range of potential interventions for urban designers and planners, and I would argue for all design professionals. professional. For it's the space in which design intersects with these broader social, political, and economic implications and the humanities more broadly. Neil Brenner describes these meta-narratives through a range of emergent conditions, nature and urbanism, or the urbanization of nature, or as Pierre Vittorio Aurioli argues, that the world has become completely urban and what we call nature is not nature, but completely part of the urban condition. Other such narratives that fundamentally challenges our forms of engagement as urban designers is the rapid geo-economic integration, uneven spatial development. In fact, inequity, to my mind, clearly will be the biggest issue of the next decades. In some ways, the shifting demographies, the refugees that we are seeing is clearly linked to this fundamental issue. From this comes both the urbanization of poverty and the remaking of political identities and new claims to citizenships. And then squarely leads us to state reconstruction in neoliberalism and the notion of simultaneous transitions that our colleague Yves Blau speaks about, extending this into the mutated forms of democracy and the questions of the role of the state, agencies of planning, design, NGOs, civil society, etc. Yves Blau talks about this notion that transitions out of political ideologies take decades. So we will transition out, or the East Bloc will transition out of communism for decades and transition into some other form, and it'll take decades. And this will happen simultaneously. In India, we are doing the same with socialism into new forms of capitalism, some kinds of hybrids. But that transition, that simultaneous transition, has its biggest impact on the built environment because you have adjacencies that come out from completely varying kinds of ideologies, so to speak. This sort of extends further to Sibel Bozdagon, who argues that social versus aesthetic modernity, and her argument is a revealing one, where in some conditions, aesthetic modernity in architecture and by extension in city making arrived before an independent bourgeois industrialization and capital markets. And India, Latin America is a case of this. And we see that in architecture more strongly, but I would extend that into city making. And several such conditions and disjunctures that we cannot avoid in forming the core agendas of our disciplines. Because besides the scalar question beyond regionalism or planetary urbanism and the broadening of the narrative, the critical challenge for us is the narrow circumscription of our site of operation versus understanding the site as mediated through and embedded within a larger social, economic, and political process. So then the question becomes, how can we use this opportunity to have a broader social and progressive impact as urban designers beyond the site of our projects? Inspired by these constructions of the meta-narratives, one of the issues that has been of great interest to me is the question of the role of temporal landscapes in the imagination of our cities. The argument is clearly not to pose this as another form of urbanism, but argue about its inherent values in supplementing what I call the static city, but also a phenomena that is part of the expanded field of understanding the current state of urbanism globally. Basically, to identify it as one more strain of urban design and urban readings and practices that could be instrumental for both practitioners as well as for reflection for the urban designer on the ground. This is further propelled by two critical phenomena. The first is the massive scale of informalization of our cities, in that urban space is constructed and configured outside the formal purview of the state. And this one interesting diagram that Joan Busquets sort of has come up with is, well, he talks about the reversal. In the traditional city, you had urbanization, plot subdivision, and buildings, and now in the informal, it's the reverse, where you have building before the process of urbanization or infrastructure. So what does this mean in terms of sort of anticipating? Secondly is the massive shift in demography occurring around the globe. The condition of political rife will not only be accelerated through climate change and the deletion and imbalances in natural resources or the rise of natural disasters, but largely a general sense of inequity which is engulfing the globe as a result of this. And the operative question is, can the temporal landscape play a critical transitionary role in the process of flux that the planet is going to experience severely and with much more frequent occurrences? And this diagram, I just sort of put this up because, we often sitting here and listening to CNN think everyone's arriving in the US. But if you look at these lines, these are very thin lines that are coming to the US. Look at this, from India, the number of people going just to the new former Soviet states is massive. Look at the flux here just within South Asia. Look at, of course, Mexico across the American border border is massive. But there are many other sites around the world that you're going to face this. And the resources aren't going to exist as might exist in Europe and the United States to begin to absorb them within existing fabrics. And therefore, this notion of the transitionary becomes critical in intersecting with the question of the temporal. And of course, historically, it was quite different because these were controlled at port towns. But now, the randomness of this movement across the planet and across geographies and territories and the kind of aggression that it sort of causes is humongous. So this is going to be a massive problem, the depth of which I don't believe we've yet articulated. And our position as designers within this gamut of operation, I think, becomes a big question to keep the instrumentality of urban design, planning, and also landscape and architecture. In my view, framing this, so, I mean, I think, you know, we heard Rem Koolhaas, and he was talking about the urbanization of the rural, and of course this is happening, but I mean, I think the big question becomes, is this going to be a staging ground for refugees, where the urban will yet be connected, so it's just a platform for movement, or will it actually revive these landscapes? This is going to be another fascinating question, because the numbers, at least in the European condition, have already become humongous, and the crowds will continue to come as we see with what's happening. The statistics are mind-boggling. The effects that's going to happen in the way borders are going to close down. What will borders even mean will become a big question. And of course, what form will these accommodations and the transitionary landscapes take is a critical question. In my view, a framing of this phenomena under the rubric of the temporal, the ephemeral, or what I call the kinetic city, is it's a much more inspirational category for us as designers than the informal city. For it implies the transitionary rather than the transformative or absolute. In fact, the kinetic city is not a phenomena, I believe, that is restricted to India, where my research is based, but several cities around the world where in this post-industrial scenario there's resulted a new system with the fragmentation of services and production location. This is an urbanism created by those outside the elite domains of the formal modernity of the state. It's what the Indian scholar Ravi Sundaram refers to as a pirate modernity that slips under the laws of the city to simply survive without any conscious attempt at constructing a counterculture. And so that kind of begins to become the form of the city in the process. And a diagram, a lot of you have seen it. It's called the 5 stages of squatting. This is how the city gets made incrementally, but also the elasticity for public space. An ordinary street in Mumbai, which during festivals gets transformed into a Bollywood community center, but just for 10 days, and after 10 days it disappears and goes back to that. Or these great maidans, these cricket fields, this wonderful Indian game of cricket that the British invented for us, which is very popular, becomes the transformed wedding venues, and the cricket pitch no one touches because that's sacred territory. But here you have wedding, the club members have high tea and samosas while the wedding operates, and in the morning it's back to cricket. Of course, it makes you think about the instant city, archigram, and that whole sort of literature, which is interesting. For me, the characteristics of this are elasticity, incrementalism, the appropriation and reappropriation of space, and the idea of soft thresholds, which allow different forms of transgression between different parts of society. Of course, architecture is not even the spectacle of the kinetic city as I describe it, and there are many other festivals which are temporal in nature, where there are no mechanisms to contain the memory of these spectacles. This flux is interesting that it actually occurs at the national level. And this is, data from the 2001 census. I just want to share with you 4 or 5 slides because the findings are really interesting for the Indian context. And this is 2001 data. We've just requested the university, Neil, many of us, to buy the new data. But this is how the government sort of defines what are towns. And the census data identifies around 8,000 places that meet the criteria to be urban areas, which is what you see there. And so this tells you that India's population is about 30% urban. And this is based on 3 criteria, which is population number, population density, and economic activity. Now, our little group that is working on this, Saurav, a student here, Saurav Bishwas, and some others, in deconstructing the data, we said let's use only population, which means let's just forget the density criteria and let's forget the employment criteria. And we took the 2001 data and we set 5,000 people settlements, which is what makes it urban as one of the criteria, and the number doubles, which means you have 18,000 places that are urban that are over 5,000 people, more than most European villages, which is totally mind-boggling if you look at the numbers. Then you begin to say that let's just use the population density as a criteria, take out the numbers, and you get, this is the reading that you get. And this is the population density of over 400 people per square kilometer. And we find an entire range across the Gangetic Plain and the eastern and western coast, which could be considered a megapolis in the West in the context. So this tells you that about 60% of India is really urban, with those numbers that sort of come up. And you see, really, one of the criteria is that the government says if more than 75% of the population has to be involved in non-agriculture uses. So that becomes the employment category. And you see that completely breaking down if you look at it. Because between the road network, the rail network, the cropping patterns, you have an amazing flux. So really, India is, for 6 months of the year, 60% urban, and for 6 months of the year, only 30% urban, which is an amazing, amazing flux. And this is old census data, and it'll be even more startling, I can promise you, when we look at the new numbers. Then you begin to look at urbanization, and you begin to look at the smart cities, the 100 smart cities that the government of India is sort of proposing. And what's interesting is that if you begin to consider the census towns and the other towns, you get a completely different. So here, these smart cities are identified as centers. They don't even register this denser sort of fabric. And the question then becomes, is that urbanization is as much in India about moving people to places that we consider cities as about people changing villages. How smart will the governing structures be to manage this transition and this idea of flux? And it becomes a critical question. Now, this is an interesting case, and there are many like this, where if you base it on the census data, this is 60,000, 64,000 people, but it's yet a village because it doesn't meet some of the criteria, because 75% of the people here are in agriculture occupation, so it gets defined as a village, which means it's governed by village governance, which is the panchayat, etc. And I think, again, Saurabh just recently found a wonderful link where in Kerala, a corporation that operates here has won the panchayat elections. So the corporation is going to run this village, but it's 100,000 people, which is like any substantial town. So the whole system is breaking down completely, one, because the criteria for reading the census data is completely different, but also flux is not part of this imagination in how we look at it. And so this Bombay, Mumbai, Delhi corridor, for example, doesn't register it registers this, but it doesn't register the kind of nuanced reading which would completely alter even formations of infrastructure and how that might occur. Because what essentially happens is you have villages like this, which are now confronted with a paraphernalia of neoliberal kinds of things, which are large agriculture processing units, etc. Now, the 30% I refer to here in real numbers is approximately 400 million working people, which is larger than the United States. And surely permanence of urban form is not the solution to this flux. And it's here that we should look, I believe, at the temporal landscape as a productive category beyond the informal city. Spontaneous settlements don't often make viable physical settlements from the perspective of public health, social justice, and so our mandate should be one of sort of anticipation through reading this flux in this sort of, in this manner. In fact, the phenomenon of flux is critical to these cities and nations being connected to the global economy. However, I think the spaces it creates have been largely excluded from the cultural discourse on globalization, which has really focused on the elite domains of production in the city. Now, this is what I'm referring to is not the city of the poor, which is where, again, the informal gets automatically kind of equated, and the kind of the non-productive sort of category, I believe, the informal, and it's the way it's universalized is really not helpful to us as designers. So this is not an argument for making our cities temporary, rather one that recognizes the temporal as an integral part of the city, seeing what spaces exist within this and what are the possibilities for urban design imagination, all the way from its urban form, public spaces, but also its governance structure, which I'll talk about in a second. The ephemeral, I think the issues that could be negotiated within this broad rubric of the ephemeral or temporal are as diverse as memory, geography, infrastructure, sanitation, public health, governance, and ecology. These parameters unfold their projective potentials, offering alternatives not only for rethinking cases within the boundaries of an ephemeral urbanism, but also how to embed perhaps softer, more robust systems in more permanent cities. Andrea Branzi advised us on how to think of cities of the future. He suggested we need to learn to implement reversibility, avoiding rigid solutions and definitive decisions. He also suggested approaches which allow space to be adjusted, reprogrammed with new activities not foreseen, not necessarily planned. Ephemeral urbanism as an idea, I would think, acknowledges the need for re-examining permanent solutions as the only mode for the formulation of urban imaginaries, and instead imagining new protocols that are constantly reformulated, readapted, reprojected in a reiterative search for a temporary equilibrium that reacts to a permanent state of crisis. In the case of the Kumbh Mela, albeit an extreme one, and several others of which I will briefly share in concluding my talk over the next 10 minutes, strongly inform this imagination of the simultaneous validity of both temporal and permanent urbanism in various dimensions, but questioning permanence and stability as a default condition. So the Kumbh Mela, Mohsin sort of mentioned this, was a project that grew out of my own interest in the kinetic city. And when I heard this was happening, we began to mobilize people across the university because of its complexity. And this turned out to be a very large project. And this is just the cover of the book that came out of it. But it was sort of formulated around a few domains which we felt also replicate questions in urban systems. One was religion, the other was urbanism, the third was business. In fact, one of the undergrads did a wonderful study. She just followed these flowers from the geography in which they were grown all the way through the Kumbh Mela and mapped it, just this one marigold, which is a sacred flower. We also looked at technology. This was the first Kumbh Mela. The Kumbh Mela happens every 12 years where there were cell phones. And so what was possible with the cell phones was the research of the business school and something that's yet going on. Health, public health was a massive component, and the public health people lived there for the 55 days of the duration, trained volunteers, and they've come up with incredible data, but they've also come up with, they were challenged to create new apps and new software to map these kinds of places in flux and of the scale like this. Of course, governance was a big issue. How do you bring these two characters together? Engineering was, of course, a big component, which you'll see. But this is how the project was formulated. It was these schools. We created rosters of hundreds of questions before going there because, it worked as an interdisciplinary project because it was such an out-of-the-box problem. No discipline had a preconception of what to sort of expect on the site. And so the Kumbh Mela occurs every 12 years. It's based on imagination of a virtual altar, of a sacred space and the compelling sort of reason so many people go there is the Hindus believe that there are 5 days in the 12 years. If you bathe at that spot, you're freed from rebirth. So that's quite compelling and a great incentive. But essentially, the festival occurs at the confluence of the Ganges and the Yamuna, happens every 12 years. What's interesting is that in the monsoon, that's how it floods. That's the Ganges in full flood. In the end of October, the waters recede, and they start constructing the city at the end of October, and they have November and December to really accommodate 7 million people who will live there for 55 days, but also the facilities that about 100 million people will visit on those different days. So the scale of this is mind-boggling. The cell phone research has ascertained that the minimum threshold that you would establish, Tarun Khanna and people, was 72 million people, which means it would be upward from there. So even if one takes that sort of lower number, it's a massive amount. And so here you see this this is from the previous Kumbh, but that's how it gets laid out on the sand banks. What is interesting is that this is a city when it sort of develops. It's about up to Central Park on Manhattan. That's the extent and the size of it. And these are sort of just some documents. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but you see the before and after. That same road is that alignment of that road. This tree is that tree. So once the water dries up, the whole city is kind of built. And these are all before and after, which were done through a kite because we couldn't get permission for drones and aerial photography. So these were mounted and done by fixed positions. This is the confluence where the devotees come in to bathe bathe, and these are sand bags which are made by using the sand from the bank, so it's all sort of disposable at the end, and that's what the city sort of looks like. And again, those are before and after. These are details of the different quarters within the grid. It sort of opens up some very interesting questions for research, but for also application around such settlements. And it has to do with private-public partnerships, because the grid allows the government to use the grid to focus on infrastructure where each sector is then settled by different groups based on their own beliefs and their own paradigms. But also the idea of material geography, how the whole region is sort of used through the train, road, river system, and materials are bought in, but after the festival they're taken out and recycled. And this was something we couldn't research adequately. You would have needed a year for this, but it's got great potential because the material all gets recycled back into that geography. So from this sort of watery terrain, a whole city emerges using a grid. And what's interesting is that every 12 years, you don't know where the river is going to settle, so the grid becomes the robust instrument by which they can actually anticipate and plan how they settle it. And what's wonderful is that every road on that grid goes across the river as a bridge. So it's a very robust grid. It's not like in many cities where there are 3 bridges across a grid that goes over 10 miles, but every road goes across the grid. So it's as robust a grid as you can potentially get. And here you see every bridge going across. So it takes of course, for movement and things, it becomes critical in order to do this. But it allows to negotiate the shifting terrain and the shifting sort of geography of the river itself, which occurs also during the festival, as you can see in some of these locations. Sorry, I don't know why that happens. Yeah. And these are the pontoon bridges, and that's where engineering becomes important. We were very grateful to 3 students who digitized this from the satellite map, and God, we were, really grateful they did this, because now from this you can measure. We've got every tent mapped here, so you can measure densities, you can make projections of all kinds. One of the interesting things was, for people who are interested in rapid deployment, is the entire city for 7 million people, built in 2 months, was built out of just these 5 materials: 8-foot-long bamboo, screws and nails, string and coir, corrugated metal, and some form of skinning, which was either textile or plastic. These were the 5 materials the entire city, or its habitation, so to speak, were made out of at all scales. And this is something we studied in great detail. And you see that 8-foot bamboo that goes into these different configurations down to scales like that, which then get clad to make community centers, which have celebration. And every quarter has these large celebration sort of spaces, but different kinds of, where many simultaneous sort of ceremonies can occur. These are some of the statistics just to, it really does replicate a mega city, and that's why we called it mapping the ephemeral mega city, because it's over 7 million people. And that's why the material geography becomes important in the way this goes in and out. And I'm happy to answer questions if there are particular ones, but this is a very long lecture otherwise. And it's really about religion, where people come to consult these leaders, so to speak. That's what the streets look like. Every quarter, every neighborhood, so to speak, is marked by its own entrance. So it kind of replicates it. The fascinating thing, and this is why I sort of want to make the point that temporality as a notion is not just about things that look temporary in terms of a little kind of tent or a habitat, but it's also the governance structure. One can think in terms of time, even with governance. And this is the mapping of the entire, these are all the characters that were involved in the Kumbh Mela. And this was done by, actually through Radcliffe, bringing all the chief players to Radcliffe for 3 days and mapping their conversations to create these interrelationships. So the first year, before they even have the terrain, it happens at the level of the state government. And these are the characters that are involved. It's really top-down planning, where policies are put into place, teams are put into place, budgets are bought in, you begin to have sanctioning and master plans, so more people come in, but it's all controlled by this young man who's the chief minister of the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is the biggest state in India. It has about 200 million people, so it's a large state that he looks after. And the police and other people get gone. Then the administrative service comes in, which is the professional administrators. This guy is the chief secretary, and his whole team begins to overlap with that. And they begin to, again, do this top-down. And then at implementation, this man becomes in charge. He is the Mela Adhikari, or the commissioner, for 6 months. He has the powers just for 6 months. And he has the powers of a district magistrate, which means he can bring the army in, he can go into national communication with the center and things like that. And the whole the whole hierarchy flips completely. And there's a different governance system that gets put into place. Of course, there are connections, but then he has the ability to go outside the circle for subcontracting, for emergency work. Something goes wrong, he has the ability and the power to go out and reach out within the market to do this. And there, of course, there are minimal interrelationships during implementation where the chief minister can communicate directly with someone who's in charge of roads or someone who's in charge of electricity. And it's wonderful that this hierarchy flips at different stages. And this is what I mean about temporality in a broader way, where one can be inspired not only by the physical habitat and the fact that it looks temporary, but even in the way governance structures are thought about in terms of administration over time. And this is just very quick slides of how the city is made. The sand is leveled when the water recedes. The roads are put into place. So the grid is formulated first so that the people can begin to organize themselves in the different sectors, which then people self-organize them once they're allocated particular pieces of land. They make the land sacred, which is part of the ritual, and then they begin to build and decorate. The infrastructure simultaneously goes on the grid because that's free of encumbrances because people are organizing themselves. Sanitation, public toilets, and the city sort of emerges and begins to come alive. It is about ritual. It is about, these are the high priests offering milk to the goddess, the Ganges, and then it's about demolition. So it finishes in March, and in 2 weeks, the whole city disappears. And this is a photograph taken from the same kite 1 week after the festival was over. It's completely erased. What is left are mats like this, which are memories of the tents on which people sort of slept, which are decomposable. But what's interesting is that the grid has been set up. It's only the end of March. The monsoon comes at the end of June. So they have April, May. The farmers in the locality move in, and the grid is perfect because it sets up a system where they can occupy different parts of the grid, and they actually get 2 crops. So it's used productively because it's been leveled. It's very fertile because of all the septic tanks, I guess. And the cows and everyone sort of comes in, and here you can see them tilling it, and it becomes a productive landscape for 2 months before the river swells again in the monsoon, and the terrain disappears completely, and the river sort of is in full sort of swell, leaving only this little memory, or this strong memory. And I remember going up, I always quote this to the high priestess who had helped us a lot, and a woman, Sadhvi, and I went to thank her and seek her blessings. And her way of responding to me was she put her hand on my head and she said, "You should feel blessed that the Mother Ganges allowed you to sit in her lap for a few days." So that is their imagination of how this works. Now, we've extended this research into this broader rubric of what we're calling ephemeral urbanism. And this we've tried to extend to look at other typologies and taxonomies. And there's a whole group. I ran this as a seminar. Mariano, many other students, Felipe Vera, who's now graduated, Jose Mehrotra, were all part of these sort of discussions. And of course, the ephemeral in that sense, I mean, there's a history of it. If you start Christmas markets, I mean, it's amazing how these have been historically very much part of a kind of embedded reality within cities. Or in Mexico, these new markets on parking lots, which service on a cyclic kind of way, the way the city sort of operates. Or, you know, look at these, they appear and they disappear. But this is massive in terms of how it contributes to the economy, but also the number of people it engages in the desert. And this is for jewelry that these RVs sort of meet. This is a big exhibition. Or mining towns for extraction, where the temporality is a different time frame. They last for 40 years, 100 years, etc. Burning Man, and this is a close-up of Burning Man. You see the grid and the organization and the kiosks within. Or Hajj, which of course each of these are different in the ways they interface with existing infrastructure, the movement of people and the problems associated with it, or the military. And some of these, including refugee camps, have now been around for decades. And so what does that mean? And so this whole question of how does one embed the imagination of time within the discourse of planning and urban design, I think, is what these sort of questions sort of emerge with this. Or Haiti, I mean, this is now been around for, many years already, and God knows how long it'll be around, or camps like this. Because the ephemeral, I think, has much to teach us about planning and design. In fact, it represents an entire surrogate ecology, urban ecology, that grows and disappears on and off, often on extremely tight temporal scales. In short, this notion of the ephemeral, I believe, as a productive category within a larger discourse on urbanism more generally, is worth serious consideration. And, look at Zatari, and now it's beginning to get formulated really as a town, and they're identifying places. So the way we've done this, just to share the research and its sort of preliminary, is create these 7 taxonomies of transaction, of religion, of strife, of military, of refuge, of celebration, and of extraction. And they're all completely different. And, this is like for transaction. What's interesting in these 7 parts of this taxonomy, we've already identified about 350 cases. And these are all upwards of 20,000 people involved. So these are not small. And there are 350 such conditions where this occurs. This market in Thailand, which is so amazing that it occupies a rail line, but it actually pulls back every time the train comes with great precision. And you look at the precision with which this happens. People even, don't let their fruit go up above a certain height so it can be below the train. And this goes on for about 5 or 6 miles. It's not like it's 100 yards. It's like huge. Or celebration, we've already come up with 54 cases of large gatherings which come together. An extraction one that, is also about 31 cases that we are sort of looking at. And you can see them here mapped on this sort of Google image, but also in the details of their relationships to the mine, what that means, because that has an effect on the temporal scale, but also mapping them in terms of time and function, but also looking at the time typologies for the different sites of extraction. And some, of course, disappear in 3 or 4 years, some stay for 40 years, and what this might mean. I mean, this is all at its sort of exploratory stage. So just in conclusion, urban design today, I think, in the global arena has evolved into new hybrid forms of practice, which often result in, I believe, a richer version of the earlier conventional practice. In this, the practice has transformed to become, I believe, more inclusive, thereby recognizing its dependency on other actors and agencies for implementation and multiple domains for its design. Integral to this new emerging approach are incremental strategies, multifaceted feedback loops, making the process of urban design, I believe, increasingly dynamic. New technologies facilitate this in a more nuanced, fine-grained, and grounded register of the reality we operate in. Perhaps emblematically, urban design today is in a place between the city of the captive globe, as sort of represented by Rem Koolhaas, an intuitive exploration premised on architecture, perhaps as the sole instrument of representation, and the instant city premised on temporality, between formalism and functionalism, between the temporary and informal, really in the space of transition, because the simultaneous validity of both these conditions is what we should accept. This, I believe, challenges conventional notions of urban design and dissipates really the differences between developing the tools for advocacy and engaging in advocacy, creating new models that combine both. Sometimes these are differentiated, but today, to be effective, they are more often than not collapsed into a singular entity or process. Then urban design really is about how these spatial possibilities play out to influence the quality of lives, of our economy, society, evolving culture, and the broader well-being of the planet. In its broadest view of its sort of planetary implication and coupled with its sort of ecological mode and an ecological way of thinking that will register us, I believe, for questions of equity and humanism in the context of our operations. And finally, I believe that the choice for us is between being the thermometer and the thermostat. While we need both, finally, it's the instrumentality of design, one that is socially engaged and elastic in its intellectual configuration, that will be relevant for the future. Thank you very much.
Rahul, thank you so much for this tour de force, taking us through 180 slides. So when I saw the 100,
counting them.
When I saw the 180, I thought it would take me 3 hours. So I was very happy that he did it in exactly 1 hour. Really, this was fantastic. I'm sure that there'll be lots of questions. I think one of the things that I mean, there were so many wonderful themes that were covered in your talk. But of course, one of the obvious ones was the duality between permanence and impermanence, and the kind of potential productive benefits of ephemerality in relation to questions of permanence. We also know from the examples that you show in terms of the whole discussion of camps, in a way, that these cover both positive as well as negative things. It has a certain level of kind of fecundity of the kind of life that you mentioned with the Kumbh Mela, where sometimes when we talk about this, we say that the kind of strategies that exist in the formation of the Kumbh Mela would actually be very helpful in terms of the discussion of the permanent city in places like India, because it's much more strategically organized. And of course, we learned from the examples of other forms of kind of encampment what a horror the temporal can be in terms of what it provides or what it doesn't, what it fails to provide. So I'm wondering whether you can speak more explicitly, or the research that you're doing with your group, you have started to look at the interrelationship between the temporal and the permanent in a little bit more detail. What are the kind of lessons that one can really bring into the more permanent through the study of the temporal? Some of the things, for example, the instant city, many of these exist in relation to the permanent. So the infrastructure of the permanent is a necessary precondition for the temporary to exist. And I think if you go to a place like China and tell them, I have this wonderful idea for you for an ephemeral city to replace Shanghai, I think it would be hard for people to sort of buy that. So I'm wondering if there is now a case 55 years after the formation of the urban design for a new idea of the permanent that is really learning more systematically from your arguments of the ephemeral city.
Yeah. No, I think good question. I mean, I don't think it's a matter of replacement. That's what one was very clear about. But it's a matter of that synergy. And I think that's what, in my view, the Instant City attempted to do. And I was saying to Anita earlier that I was looking at J.B. Jackson's Rediscovering the American Vernacular, where he talks about these three landscapes. And he was talking about, in the first sort of evolution of settlement, you had the landscape of the decomposable. But then when we created the static city, we also created separation, an acute separation, which he writes about in great detail. And he was talking about the third landscape, which was this sort of ephemeral landscape. And he was, of course, writing in the 70s, giving the example of markets and circuses and, events which were cyclic, which allowed even different parts of society to become aware of themselves, if nothing else, but also to sometimes create an armature or an infrastructure which didn't need permanent investment. And so the temporal scale becomes important. So I think it's a matter of embedding within in a complementary way. And for urban design to first even begin to accept that as a category, I think is the first step. Going to the question of camps and things, I think what we are doing right now is merely trying to map the rhythms and the contingencies that make these places how they appear. And I think that will reveal to us the moments of where these interventions can occur. Already, if you start comparing the Kumbh Mela to, say, a camp, a refugee camp, which comes out of completely different conditions of political rife, where there's a disaggregation of communities because they don't want people to even organize themselves as communities, becomes a different problem. But as you see in Zatari and places where they are now beginning to accept the length of time it will exist, they're already beginning to reformulate it. And I think that's why anticipating the transitory as a category becomes critical, because we respond after the fact to these. I think looking at those charts, the way things are happening, we can actually begin to preempt these conditions in terms of anticipating even the terrains where places like this are made and how they are made. And within the profession, I think there are a lot of architects. Shigeru Ban comes to mind, who's doing wonderful work. But it's all related to the object of the thing. And I think, how do we extend that as urban design, as settlement, site planning, etc., becomes an open question. And I don't believe there's enough attention given to that. And we're beginning to do that through our MDes tracks, I hope, here. But I think this bridge with urban design in that terrain has a lot of potential. And of course, the Kumbh Mela is successful because it's singular in its purpose. I mean, it's the world's largest Hindu congregation. Everyone's there for a short period with a very focused agenda. So the contestations disappear completely. And I think most of the problems in our cities are about contestation or negotiation and contestation. So the parallels are not direct, but like the governance, it's temporality. I think those become interesting lessons even for refugee camps and other forms of settlement like that.
Greg, please. Do we have a mic that's Ravi?
Did I answer?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, I'll ask you something.
Rahul, I think you set the record on words per minute. So as you think about the ephemeral, is the lesson how to do the ephemeral activity from an urban design perspective better? Or is there also, well, going back to Moise's question, what are the key lessons you see from the ephemeral for the permanent?
Well, one is, I think, just the basic question that, or the impulse that we have, the impulse that we have as designers to take permanence as a default condition. Just to start with that. I mean, any problem we are given, I mean, our default condition is permanence. And I think in some cases of architectural projects, that is a much clearer agenda because, the brief is formulated in a way that implies that. But as far as urban space goes, especially in the kind of flux that I was describing, I think as professionals, planners, urban designers, landscape architects, I think that default condition is the first thing I think we can learn from. And that opens up then a whole different imagination, whether it's governance structures, but also in the way public space is delineated and its formulation, what it means. I mean, Gerald's work on privately owned public space and the kinds of default conditions that one can tweak within those. I mean, there are lots of questions that come up automatically as a result of that one fundamental question.
One of the things that seems to be coming through loud and clear with things like the Kumbh Mela is really the strength of new forms of narration, of the kind of life that these places offer. I think that was very clear in your presentation. Sometimes, some conventional forms of urban design tend to not emphasize as much these incredible kind of fecundity of life and various kind of descriptions of things that somehow the Kumbh Mela, it becomes extremely vivid how quickly it can actually generate these sorts of situations that as briefs, as program, are actually, they have also a certain relevance. So, I mean, I think that's very exciting in terms of what it opens up in terms of writing new forms of scenarios for urban design. But, Lee, can you get the mic and then, yes. Who has the mic? Moshe, you go ahead, sorry. Go. So let Moshe go. Yeah.
Looking at this through sort of our eyes, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, please go ahead. Go ahead. Okay. Go.
Well, briefly, I mean, looking at it through the eyes of the planners that we are and the urban designers that we are, and the kind of sociological phenomenon this must mean for all these people who were there during that short period of time, is it worthwhile to follow up on what happens when these people go home and what effects that might have on their own urbanization and their places that they come from?
Right.
Because that seems to be an enormous lesson that could be learned.
Oh, absolutely. No, absolutely. And I think those diagrams I had of the material geography, the intent was to be able to do that. I hope I have the energy or someone else has the energy in 12 years to do it. But there are many other occurrences like this. And one reason why we are creating that taxonomy is also to spread it out as an atlas, which is, it's impossible to study 350 cases. But if one lays it out, I think and identifies what different cases as typologies might inform our discussions, then it opens up a whole spread of research that in a university like this people can take up. But I think that reversal, both in terms of material geography but also in terms of attitudes, is what you're talking about. Could that, and how one can bring, so the question, I mean, one of the things we've been discussing, there's a course that is running at the university based on a number of coming out of this, but it's not based on the Kumbh Mela, but just looking at entrepreneurship across these different domains. And one of the things that's being discussed is how can one use this more instrumentally from the perspective till the 50s, the Kumbh Mela was the biggest vaccination camp in India because it was a way of getting people, like 100 million people for polio being vaccinated. So it was used instrumentally like that. And so the question becomes now, how can we do that through modes of education? Is it for sanitation, public health? In India, they're trying to embark on this massive project for sanitation, a toilet for every family. Could these become places where technologies like that can be disseminated? This time was the first time, and Diana X studied this in great detail, one of the high priests made environmentalism his agenda. And so they not only their own camp, but they had seminars, conferences, workshops for ordinary people from rural areas just on the question of environmentalism. So environmentalism, through the narratives of religion, in a sense, was encoded. And so this is the big potential even of these temporal gatherings in the world today with the kinds of questions we are facing. So it's a great point here. Moshe? What do you mean?
We'll bring you the mic.
We'll bring you the mic,
Just
yeah.
Moshe, you go first. Sorry.
I'd like to go back to earlier part of your lecture where you spoke about the tension between planning and urban design and capitalism. And in the 50 years of the program, we saw a continuous erosion of the credibility of planning and any regulatory mechanisms of capitalism in terms of urban development. I mean, we're emerging from the period of the market knows best. It seems to me that one of the major issues that face us today as urban designers is what kind of regulatory systems can we put in place to put some order into some of the things, I don't know if the word
yes.
order is appropriate, into some of what is happening in the development of cities. And just to be less abstract, the simple mechanism in a Chinese city that says 3 hours of sunlight on every apartment
Right.
changes the whole typology of building.
That's right.
The European legislation of insisting on maximum 8-meter depth from a window of any workspace has changed the typology of office buildings and the clustering of office buildings. So where do you see this role in terms of the urban design program, in terms of the urban design discipline as we go forward?
Wow, okay. Well, the way I would respond to that is, one is that I think these mechanisms are different in different places. I think privatization has always been part of the city, even in medieval cities. The caliphate spelled out the basic rules at the level of the house. It was private. The scale of privatization has changed dramatically. And this happens across different political ideologies in different ways and can be instrumentalized in different ways. So I think first is we can't come up with a standard. But I think what you allude to is very important, and the Chinese case, where if you took, what is the most powerful common denominator in public health? Both the examples you gave had to do with light and health and shadow and sun, I think have the greatest potency. And in a way, the kind of narratives we are building around environmentalism, sustainability, I think if they became more precise on counts like that, I think we'd have the parameters by which we could actually influence code, which is otherwise all form-based and aesthetic in a sense, which is where it's unfortunately slipped. So I think going back to the question of the narratives, I think that becomes really crucial. Is how what are the narratives in which one embeds these kinds of codification? And I think public health is going to be an important one because that's a global leveler in a way, but comfort also in terms of light and things. So I think in terms of where where will that happen with the program, I believe in the way. I think you have to encourage the interdisciplinarity to do that so that you're challenged with your business as usual kinds of views on some of this. And I think through the MDes tracks, through many others, I think if one can create the structure, and maybe the dean could speak more to this, I think it could make a kind of transformative effect.
I love you too. I think one of the things, just to I'm not going to fall for that, but one of the things that I would say actually, Moshe, which is interesting, because what is happening And I think Rahul touched on this by touching on the work or the projects of many people. I think there are a multiplicity of projects that are in process, whether it's to do with various forms of discussions of urbanization, whether it's to do with this discussion of the relationship of the connection between urbanization and health, whether it's about the revitalization of the discussion of infrastructure, the public and private, the role of real estate. I think I see these as a multiplicity of projects that are really looking at the future of the discussion of urbanization, Neil's sort of planetary urbanism. And I would not say that this concept of ephemeral is a kind of totalizing project. It's never presented as that. It's really presented as one of a kind of multiplicity of positions, which I think the school is exploring in a way that's very different than the post-war period, when the agenda in terms of the rebuilding of the city was a very clear project, and it had very specific, institutional consequences in terms of hospitals and educational facilities and so on. I think we're just in a different kind of space at the moment, and it requires a more complex set of responses. And what I feel is exciting in the school is that there are these many projects, and it is, we haven't quite figured out the interrelationship between them, but what is interesting is that there are these multiplicity of positions that we are working on. And in that sense, it's very clear that there is investigation, there is kind of speculation, and I find that actually incredibly kind of rewarding that that's happening. Peter, please.
Rahul,
Can you wait for the mic, Peter? Sorry. Oh, actually, can we just... Yeah, you go ahead, but we come back to you. So please.
Rahul, listening to you, actually, I came to the conclusion that permanence doesn't really exist. I mean, in a sense, you've described a very exacerbated circumstance of an event, really, almost an instantaneous creation of a large settlement in space and time. And, by extrapolation, we could even say that things that we think are permanent aren't. And in fact, permanence as a sort of idea in this sort of discussion seems to me to be not very relevant, frankly. I'm interested, though, are you going to work in the other direction? In other words, go to events which occur, right? And circumstances which have a spatiality that's entwined with some sort of temporal rhythm or periodicity or something like that are quite slow?
Yes? The Dean would like to answer.
No, I hope he doesn't try, actually. I'm sort of saying I don't think the permanence thing matters at all, really.
Yeah.
Right?
No, it doesn't. And I think for me, just to be more pointed in my response to your question, I think I'm kind of, I started with looking at Mumbai, starting with the time I was a student here, in terms of... Yes, as this phenomena. And I think for me, the Kumbh Mela as an extreme condition suspended in this reality opened up many, many possible avenues, including governance and many other aspects, public health, which is why I think for me it was a very fecund kind of interdisciplinary experience. And I would like to now go back to the city and look at what Moshe was asking about. What are the implications for code? How does one make these spaces? How does one instrumentalize some of these readings of the temporal as a productive category within the permanent? Challenging. I mean, I think the permanent and the temporary work together. There's a kind of synergistic relationship. One depends. I mean, then they both are. None of it is permanent. The buildings might last for 100 or 200 years. The other stuff might last for 2 weeks. And so how does one create a productive interrelationship between these, also in the broader imagination of codification, of development plans, and other instruments that we use as planners and urban designers is, I think, the question that seems to interest me at this moment.
Please. Go ahead.
Hi. My question is about the seduction of computerized renderings. If we look at Dholera SIR, which is the Delhi-Mumbai corridor, so the proposal where cut and paste of Mumbai, Shanghai, Dubai, all of that together. So this is a practice which is a proposal based. So you have some of the greatest consultants and large firms which is coming in parts of the world in smaller places, no-name places, and building new cities. In China, in last 20 years they built 200 cities, and a lot of them are vacant cities. A lot of this is practice and proposal driven, which is by the professionals. This is my wonder about this cyber architecture of cut and paste.
Well, I mean, first of all, China, I think you have to be careful. Well, first is I think the Chinese got their act together. I think what we have to in India accept is we don't have the capacity to respond to what's happening in there. And so therefore, you have foreign consultants, as you're referring to. And I think then it's a matter of creating the infrastructure. If we can't create the capacity to deliver on the ground, then the infrastructure to interface with those consultants, which is what in China they pulled off, I think, in much better terms than India. I think China, the urbanization perhaps happened very quickly, but about these towns being empty, I mean, I think someone like Peter would know that better. There is some reversal that's occurring and catching up. So, I mean, I don't think one can even make a blanket statement on that. I don't know China well enough. But I think in India, the problem is the lack of capacity. The difference between India and China, if I may frame this more broadly, is India had leaders like Nehru, which were very liberal minds with very conservative policies, and they all came from a liberal arts background, and the social was very critical. In China, you had exactly the opposite. And China privileged infrastructure as the instrument to weld it together as a functioning nation, because also through the Cultural Revolution, they had flattened what might have been these other social questions. India is now reversing its stance, and it's beginning to realize that it's sort of back on the infrastructure, both in terms of capacity to deliver, but also capacity to imagine and to design. I mean, Tom Friedman, I think, described this quite well in The World is Flat. He said, India is like 12 people in an ambassador car with no air conditioning, everyone's sweating, going down a bumpy road, and all hoping that in the horizon there'll be a smooth freeway. In China, it's 4 people sitting in a BMW with seat belts, Mozart playing on the stereo system, cruising down at 120 kilometers, knowing that in the horizon there may be a bumpy road. So it's two great countries that have taken completely different paths, but their aspirations are the same. And I think India at the moment is at a spot where it doesn't have the capacity to deliver what its ambitions are, and China managed to do that.
The cut and paste, like the BRT,
Well, cut and paste.
I think this is a great moment to stop on this wonderful story. May there be smoothness at the end of the bumpy road. Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you, Rahul.